let's go back to the agenda, and I'd like to pass on the floor to James Hitchmough, a professor and a leading expert on sustainable gardening and head of the Department of Landscape Design in the University of Sheffield.
I don't speak any Russian at all, not even a single word, you know. Good, okay, well, hello everybody. How many were here last year? Stick your hand here last year. It's the same people. Okay, well, I'm not giving the same talk, so that's okay. Okay, so I want to talk about this. I want to talk about how do you integrate aesthetic and ecological ideas in the city, because that's actually the challenge for all of us, because you cannot sort of simply have ecological ideas without people actually feeling positive about them. So that's what I want to talk about. I just want to say a little bit about where I come from. If you were here last year, I probably used this slide then, and I just wanted to, I live in that building. So that's the Arts Tower. I spend most of my life there. But I guess what I really wanted to do is, I really wanted to talk a little bit, kick off and say a little bit about this. And one of the things about the department I work in, it's a very big department, but the really interesting thing about it is it's very much about, it's a research department in landscape architecture, and they are very rare. And so it's very much about trying to develop an evidence base for what we do in landscape architecture. And actually, landscape architecture is not a very evidence-based subject. It's mostly what we call a heuristic discipline. That's when you learn through doing. And learning through doing is a really powerful technique, but it has its limitations. And I think we also need to have a little bit more evidence, because we constantly need to reinvent ourselves and think new things all the time. I work a lot in China, so I know China very well. You know, I've been 50 times. And there in China, very often you say, let's do this. And they say, oh, no, we can't do that. You know, no one can do that. And when I'm hearing discussions, I see similar echoes of the same ideas that, oh, no, we can't do that. Yesterday we were talking about whether trees could be at an angle, and someone said, oh, no, we can't do that in Russia. Russia cannot have straight, non-straight trees. You know, and heurism often leads to these slightly crazy sort of positions. And what I'm really against is dogmatism and being fixed in a position. We have to evolve, we have to change constantly, we have to reinvent what we believe over and over again. And that's really helped when you are also interdisciplinary. So I work in a department where there are landscape architects, I'm a plant ecologist, stroke horticultural scientist, stroke designer, bit of environmental psychology thrown in. There are artists, there are historians, you know, there are planners. There's a whole range of people with different views of the world. So I want to talk about some of these ideas. Hey, and I also want you to buy that. Now it's in Russian. Give me your cash is what I want type thing. And we'll just move on about now. Okay, so I want to ask some questions. So you know, what are some of the values of vegetation in 21st century cities? And what I'd suggest to you, look, there's a whole range of values, but I want you to look at the ones in red, because I think they're two of the really core values. Firstly, vegetation's primary role should be to enrich human experience, and by that I mean well-being in all its physical and psychological forms. So the role of planting is to make people feel better, more positive, have better health. But the other key value is it must also support as much non-human life as possible. So supporting biodiversity. So you've got those two things. And for many people, there's a conflict in that. And so that's one of the really things that we really need to deal with. And of course, that's going to be a lot of my talk today is going to be about how do you manage that potential conflict. Now in Britain, I'm going to ask another question. Do we place value on planting in cities? Now, many of you seem to work in what you might call the garden sector in Russia. But I mainly work in the public arena. So I mainly work in cities and this sort of stuff, and most of the landscape architects I work with, really don't, in many cases, place much value on vegetation. They talk the talk. They say they do. They clap Greta Thunberg, the goddess of the new time, So Greta's a really useful tool to beat landscape architects with, to make them better. But if you look at Britain, for example, this is some recent research. Only 7% of the landscape projects undertaken in Britain by landscape architects are anywhere near what the planning conditions were. They simply are changed through substitution, through contractors. 56% of landscape architects take no interest in biosecurity. That's the future resilience of vegetation in Britain. They don't think it's their job. They think it's someone else's. But it's not. It's them. They are the ones. But they think it's not me, Gov. Theirs job. And finally, although they talk the talk about sensitivity to environment, to culture, to context, the evidence is they use the same 50 plants throughout their whole life. So it's all bullshit. Okay? It's talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So that's a real issue, isn't it? And when you have conversations with landscape architects about this, they often say, oh yeah, I'm really, really interested in plants. And one of the reasons sometimes we have a problem is we all have these, what we might call knowledge halos for how we see the world. So for any bit of knowledge we hold, as you move further away, we know less and less and less. And what happens in many cases with landscape architects, they know so little about plants that you can't have a conversation with them about it because they simply don't know how little they know. So for years with my colleagues in Sheffield, they've always said, oh yes, yeah, well, I don't know why we need you, James, because I know all about plants already. We all know about them. I've done a little analysis of my colleagues in Sheffield, so you mustn't share this with them. And there's 22 of them, and about 4 are very knowledgeable and interested in plants. 5 are very unknowledgeable and completely disinterested in plants. And you can see the rest, And this pretty much reflects landscape architecture as a discipline, if we're honest about it. I was in the USA a lot last year, and I was at Berkeley, which sees itself as one of the world's leading landscape architecture schools. And I was having a conversation, and if you do a master's degree at Berkeley, in 2 years you do no planting design classes whatsoever. None. So the Americans have deluded themselves into thinking you don't need to know anything about vegetation. I'm going to tell Greta. She'll get him. You should really read this book when it's translated into Russian. It's written by a guy called Julian Raxworthy. He's an Australian who works in Australia. And he's a sort of landscape architect who, a bit like you, came really from like a horticultural background. And he wrote this book, and what it really says is, it's rather long and turgid, I have to say. It needs a better editor. But what it really says is that we have to start rethinking how we do and see landscape architecture. And we have to stop seeing it as simply a contractual period of 1 or 2 years, and then we piss off. We need to reinvent landscape architecture in a different way. It's not fit for purpose in many cases as it is. It's all front-end loaded, you design something and then you leave. So we need to find some way to get a longer-term view. Really interesting is, I love this. These are all the good and the great in the USA saying, oh yeah, this is a revolutionary book. And these are all people who presided over university landscape architecture departments with no planting design in. So, what has my own work sought to do? Well, I guess what I've tried to do is I've tried to integrate understandings gained from ecological and horticultural science with environmental psychology research and design processes to create design toolkits so our students can hopefully do better than this. And so I've tried to sort of make vegetation a more central and cognitive process in landscape architecture. And a more phytocentric worldview. To do that, I spent a lot of time looking at vegetation and nature. I get off on that. I like doing that stuff. It's more interesting than being in the office. And I've looked all over the world, you know, these places I have been. And I've been to many of these dots many, many times. And what I've done is I've used these experiences in nature, A, for inspiration. Because when you go to Kazakhstan and you walk through those 2-meter-high Aramuras, you are changed. It is a transcendental experience, a moment in time. You are not the same afterwards. And you have seen things that very few other people have ever seen. So it's not the same, oh, how do I resort the bottles in the design? It's something new, something different, something profound, perhaps. And you also learn about the culture of how these landscapes are made. So instead of just seeing these landscapes as sort of photographs, you realize they are often, they are the product of human interaction over millennia with this landscape. He makes this landscape. He cuts every night after 4 o'clock when it cools down. He makes the landscape, and his forefathers have been making this landscape for 10,000 years in the same way. So it gives you more of an in-depth understanding. And it also allows you to look at things and think about how the 3-dimensional pattern of nature, how it is made, and how can you as a designer interact with this? What can you achieve and what you cannot achieve? It makes you much more savvy. So, you know, that pattern there in Colorado, that's a product of a lot of drought in late summer on very fertile soils. And, you know, when you go to places like this is in Western China, you know, this is the original primeval forest. This forest has been there, you know, for 20 million years. It's never been glaciated, and it's an extraordinary place to go to in terms of, you know, what a landscape, what a fabulous place. But one of the really interesting things about this is this landscape, this is how Western Europe looked before the last ice age. So Western China and Europe shared a lot of the same species up to 2.6 million years ago. So you then begin to think, well, hang on a minute. You know, all the narratives we have at the moment about native, meaning, oh, it was been there for the last 10,000 years after the Ice Age. It's a really interesting question when you suddenly realize a lot of Chinese species are really British natives too, who were simply interrupted by the Ice Age. So you get a bigger picture by doing all of this sort of thing. But then, of course, you have to come back to reality, and you have to say, well, how do I shoehorn these ideas into the 3 things, aesthetics, urban tolerance, and function, that we deal with in urban landscapes? Now, I want to ask you a question. This is a little trick question for landscape architects who aren't interested in plants. You'll all do really well, because you're obviously all interested in plants. But I often ask landscape architecture groups around the world, of what you do, what has the most meaning in terms of the ordinary members of the public? Okay? So we can split what we do into 3 things. We can split it into things which are physically present, such as topography, earth, built form, water, vegetation, people. We don't make people, but we create an environment to pull them in, so we facilitate people. And then you have time and space, which is physically present and also in our heads. And then you have stuff that's just in our heads. Narrative, identity, character, interaction with cultural constructions, you know, how value is made, etc. Observation of wildlife. And if you ask people, what of those, all of those things, which is the most powerful for human well-being? Yeah? And I would suggest to you, it's vegetation. It's not the other stuff. Who stands at paving slabs? I've seen a lot of paving slabs in the last day and all those designs. My God, that's a beautiful paving slab. Oh, my heart soared as I saw it. Oh, I love that shuttered concrete wall. Only weirdos do that. Only architects and landscape architects do that. It's a cult. It means nothing to them, except you walk on it. So, we really need to get, this is Manchester. This won awards, lots of awards. Who would want to be in that space unless you are doing drugs? I mean, the only reason I'd want to be there if I wanted to pimp drugs or have sex with someone who's lying on the grass too. And yet it won awards because it looked good on a computer screen. Strong pattern. So that won awards. Most people hate it, but we made it. That's the sort of stuff we make. Yeah, because we're children of fashion, aren't we? Right. Offset oblique. Oh, I love it. Very French, actually. Just a copy from La France. That's what it was like before that was made. Now look, that's really crude in terms of design understanding. It was probably made by the city engineer. But I think for most human beings, that would be a richer solution than what we have now. So you have to ask yourself really interesting and often difficult questions about this, about the recipients of your wisdom. This is some work in the department, and what this tells you is, as gardens get bigger, big garden, little garden, this is how often people go to the doctors. We have all the medical records of the people in Sheffield, so we know who goes to the doctors, how often, and where they live. It's all anonymized, we don't know who they are. And there is if you have a big garden, you are weller. If you have a smaller garden, you are sicker. Okay? And that happens even when you strip out all the affluence things, even when you take all that away statistically, everyone responds in the same way. They do not respond in the same way to green space. Having a lot of green space does not make you go to the doctors less. Green space does not, on the basis of the Sheffield sample, make you weller. There's something about gardens that does. And I would suggest it's something about interaction psychologically and emotionally with these spaces. But you don't get it for green space, because green space is often very detached, isn't it, from engagement in psychological terms. Especially the Manchester thing, which is just shit, really. I hope no one in the audience designed the Manchester thing. Oh, did you do it? It's his fault. It's him. When I was in California, I traveled around a lot, of course, and I like this place. This is a nursery called Annie's Annuals. It's a sort of hipster nursery. It's really cool. It's in a very run-down part of San Francisco where everyone's got guns, you know, on the street. And this is not the police. This is a sort of drug-barren world. Anyway, and this, I really like this. It's rich and it's exciting and it's really sort of wow. And I said to the students at Berkeley, why don't you make shit like that? And they all shuddered at the idea. But actually, a lot of them had been, and they actually thought it was wonderful too. But it's not what they were taught to design. Far too much human engagement. And vegetation is powerful because it creates a platform for a whole range of things: evidence of care, deep philosophical meanings, appreciation of spatial change, endless capacity for narrative, attracting other species, seasonal change, joy, elation, you know, appreciation of time. A paving slab does not do that. Put your fingers in your ear. Now, this is the National Botanic Garden in I'm an Australian citizen too, so I can say this sort of stuff, you know. So this is the Australian National Botanic Garden in just outside Melbourne in Cranbourne, done by Taylor Cullity, who I like very much as a practice. But there's a poverty in this. The thing about this garden is the hard works are fantastic. It looks as if they ran out of money on the soft works. You know, and I just want to walk. The essence of the Australian bush is it's very diverse. The grain is very fine. And then you get a monoculture of some restioid. Not quite doing it for me. So all the intellectual energy went into the paving design. Very little intellectual energy went into the monoculture. Okay, so how do people see these sorts of things? We see vegetation in potentially two ways. This is me being an environmental psychologist now, okay? Sometimes you see vegetation as unpleasant and it makes us sad, and sometimes vegetation on this side makes us happy. And one of the ways it can make us happy is through what psychologists call restoration. That's like stress reduction, suddenly feeling, oh, I feel better. With nature, that sort of stuff. So we call that subtle restoration and well-being, okay? That's the first way we see vegetation, if we see it positively. So a place like that, for example, that's not designed by landscape architects, it's just nature colonizing land, which was previously industrial areas in the city I live in. This is the original industrial works which were left. And that's really, for me, I find that a very relaxing, restorative environment for me. But that's because I am an ecocentric. I have constructed my head, and I have been selected because of my DNA, to feel a close affinity with nature. That's why I do all that stuff in the wild. If you're talking to a government officer in Beijing, and you show them that, they go, "Ah! It's dirty. It's horrible. It's not how cities should be. Cities should be about lights and pavement." And this whole question, you know, so how we see the world depends on our values, the values. Now, values are partly us, and they're constructed through the societies and the cultures and the peer groups we live in. So you might all have a variety of values. So, for example, this is me. I'm very ecocentric. I see nature as intrinsically valuable and desirable. This is Donald Trump, okay? He sees nature simply as a way to make more cash. That's it, period, the end. And in between, the rest of you are somewhere on that spectrum. Probably mostly on that side, but there might be a few. So these sort of values are really important, these values. And so when you design, you have to realize you're designing for these sorts of things. You're not simply designing because, if you're sitting on tutorials at Sheffield, you'll hear some tutors telling people stuff, which is a load of bollocks. It's just what they were taught when they were students. It's not true. So you have to ask yourself, does this seem credible in relation to human values? The other way you can see this sort of thing is through what we call the wow factor. The wow factor is when the vegetation is really stimulating and exciting. Hey, we invented the wow factor in the literature. It's my baby, it's my term. So the wow factor is when you see something and you go, whoa. Yeah, you all get that moment? In China, you get developers making these things. They're called flower fields. You pay $10 to get in. You walk around. They're very crude design-wise. And what's happening is the dopamine in your brain is being produced. And you're coming out saying, hey, I feel really good. I'm back to Chengdu today type thing. Yeah? It's a great concept, don't you think? It's what Flower Jam's about in a way. Hey, here we are last year. People queuing at -7 or -9 to see some tulips in a glass house. That's the wow factor. It's very, very powerful. They were queuing for a kilometre. Now, if you're getting people to look at your work like that, you've really made it. But not many people do they? So, you know, these measures are really, really useful and interesting. So how do we teach planting in relation to design? At Berkeley, they do it like this. They just don't do it. So they have a slab called Master Planning and Spatial Design. They see design as about space. It's about space. That's it. Nothing in the space. It's just about space. Now that's a delusion. That's a ridiculous delusion, which is unfit in the time of Greta Thunberg. We should all be ashamed about this. These people need to be shamed. They need to be outed. You know? I mean, I'm getting outed because I'm here, because I flew here. People who do this sort of stuff, they should be outed too. Oops, sorry. And then, in some institutions, they teach it like this. In a lot of Central Europe, they have botanists who teach the plant stuff. Now, these botanists know nothing at all about design. And so you have this schizophrenic experience for the students. Design, plants. They never touch. They're like matter and antimatter. You know, they cannot touch. That's not the way to go. And you get these, some of you might have worked on projects where you get these schizophrenic collaborations between ecologists and designers, and they just sit looking at one another like separate species. They just don't get it. And the designers say, oh yeah, and the ecologists just feel frustrated. So, Toolkit. What do I mean about design Toolkit? What I believe is you need to teach students how to integrate knowledge of plants and ecology and horticulture and all the other things to do with the plants into a creative questioning design practice. It's not about poetry, it's about a toolkit to do things better or different. So the idea is, if you move lever A, how will that change the design? So, California. This is in the wild. This is Dodecathion in spring. A lot of people see that, and they probably go back to their offices and think, oh, we need to have some of that in Berkeley. This is what they made. So what they didn't understand is, they didn't understand how that is there. They didn't understand the ecological rules by which allows that to be. And so what happened is, soil they use is too fertile, so there's too much competition pressure from the grass. And so the wildflowers are pushed to the edge, where eventually they are eliminated. They die on the beaches like magnolias did in Western Europe in the Ice Age. That's what happened. What you need to understand these levers, which you can influence as a designer through things like soil selection, etc. But you can't do that if you believe, oh, there's a certain type of soil, there's one soil. This dogma I was talking about before, you have to be able to meld. So sometimes I work with crushed concrete. Sometimes I work with soil. Sometimes I work with sand. It just depends on what I want to achieve. So they didn't understand that, and so therefore they got what they got. So what we really need is we need this sort of true integration between planting design knowledge and spatial master planning, like that. A partnership, a melding. That's what we need. If we're going to get out of the mess we're in the 21st century, that's philosophically what we need. Yeah? Not to be asked to do the planting design at the end of a project. By then, the horse has bolted. It's too late. You've missed the opportunities. Bigger ecological levers. These are the things you can manipulate if you understand how to do so as a designer. So designers need to understand these things, not know about poetry and song. It's not about poetry. Ecology is not about poems. It's about pulling levers. Right, how about integrating ecological ideas into cultural understandings. Now, a lot of these websites begin to appear. What you do with this, you upload a picture of a landscape or a planting, and it calculates the likely biodiversity of that planting. Wow, that's pretty clever, isn't it? It's not magic. It's just based on what we know in ecological science. We know a shitload about this now, how to do this sort of thing. And what we know is that the two things that drive animal biodiversity in designed or undesigned ecosystems is the complexity of the plant communities, how spatially, my God, how spatially, do you think that's a message or something? It's about, I think it's about climate change actually. How spatially complex is the vegetation? And secondly, how taxonomically complex, how many species? If you've got a lot of complexity in terms of spatial form, and you've got a lot of taxonomic complexity, no matter what the plants are, you get high biodiversity. So this is how these systems work. They're done by ecologists, they're not done by marketing people. These are grounded in hard ecological science. Now, a lot of my work is trying to make China a more biodiverse place. Most Chinese woodlands look like that in cities, designed by landscape architects. You'll notice they have a certain elegance because they have one species, okay? And if you look at a real Chinese woodland, it looks like that. It's spatially very complex, it's taxonomically very complex. China has the richest biodiversity in the temperate world, about 31,000 species, about 5 times more diverse than Russia is, and about 10 times more diverse than the UK is. Okay, so they're hugely diverse. And yet they make this sort of stuff. Oh, and they paint the trunks white because that's one of their belief systems. Painting the trunks white makes things better. You say to them, why does it make things better? Oh, I don't know, but it just does. I smell a rat there. And the way you have to, and so when I deal with Chinese government officers, I have to try and find a way for people who are not in any way ecocentric. These people are not in any way ecocentric. They're with Trump. And so I say, well, this is what you currently do. Chinese people can only understand things if it's about food, you see. Food's very important if you're Chinese. And I say, this is what you could have. You could have the banquet. And they say, yeah, I see it. I know how we do biodiversity now. Yeah, let's go and do it. You're too kind. Okay, so how do we fit those things into a planting design process? What I suggest is, the first point is, we need to develop a conceptual planting strategy or narrative. Then we need to assess climatic suitability of the species. Then we need to assess habitats, fitness and suitability. And then we need to assess capacity of the species to compete with one another. And then we do the final things, which is see if we can buy them. And we need to take these steps as serious processes, not just, oh, yeah, we do something like that. Now, one of the things that climate change is doing is it's creating two worlds in all countries. There is the world of cities where climate change plus urban heat island effects cause huge shifts in temperatures. And then there are rural environments which are less affected, still affected, but less affected. So this creates two sort of strands of planting thought, using very different plants. So this will mainly be based around native species, and this will be mainly based around native plus non-native species. And what will happen to the native species of all countries, this is what's going to happen. You're going to have 3 categories of response. This is happening here in Moscow today. It's happening everywhere in the world. So if you think it's not happening to you, you're delusional. It's happening everywhere. These species, these native species, they will disappear because they are the least fitted ones. There'll be ones in the middle which are sufficiently fit for the climatic changes to survive, and then you will have a third group. These will invade, begin to take over, change their behavior, and you will have a completely new sifting of the flora. This is inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just going to happen, so chill out. Can't change this. It's happening everywhere. It's just what the 21st century is about. See? God agrees, you see. And this creates huge problems for landscape architecture, of course. This is sent to me yesterday by a landscape architect colleague who's designing a project in central London. And the plans they put forward, I've emphasized in red. Most of the plans, this is from the ecologist who works for the local authority. This is in the center of London. And he's saying most of the plants are non-native. Many of them are non-native and of no documented value for wildlife. So this is saying you have to use native species because only those are good for wildlife. Now look, I work a lot with native species. In China, I work almost entirely with native species. And as you will see in a minute, I am doing really some of the cutting-edge stuff in China with native species. So I'm driving nativeness forward in China, but I'm not some sort of one-trick pony. You know, I know that in the center of London, we will need to use species which are not native to do some of the human things and also some of the biodiversity things. Now, landscape architects don't normally read this stuff because you haven't got access to it. This is what I sent to the ecology officer. In Western Europe, we now know that nativeness is not very important in terms of supporting native animals. It's just not important. It makes very little difference whether you use natives or species from China or Russia. It doesn't make much difference. And there is masses now of data to support this. So I'm very happy to use native species, but I don't want to use native species because I'm living in a delusion, believing that only they support native invertebrates, because that simply is not the case in Western Europe. The evidence is overwhelming. In Australia, it's different because the floras are much more specialized, and so it's not the same. Most of the southern hemisphere is different. But in the northern hemisphere, it makes very little difference as far as we can see from the research. And even when you have non-native trees, when they come in, this paper is about how native invertebrates jump ship onto the non-natives. And they do it faster if the non-natives are in the same genera as some of the native trees. So if you've got oak trees, they very quickly jump from native oaks to, say, North American oaks. They don't see the difference. So this evidence is everywhere. So you just have to bear this in mind. So don't get too hung up about this. Don't become a sort of like a thought fascist on this. Okay, looking at growing season. Hello? Hey, come on, I didn't start at 20 past. 5 minutes. Okay, fine. So what we now do is, we look at, so when I use species, I actually plot the distributions of where they come from. The red dots are the cities we might want to use them in. The black dots are where they come from in the wild, and you see how close they are together. And you can do that in much more sophisticated ways, This is the climate of the UK now. This is the climate in 2050. I have to start asking questions about what you're going to use in the future. And, of course, Melbourne becomes Dubbo in 2050. That's your future. And Dubbo is hot as hell. It is not Melbourne. But that's what Melbourne becomes if the models are right. Passing that one. And you have to do this habitat matching stuff, So all the books tell you these species are dry species. They're really wet species. A lot of the literature is very poorly informed, the horticultural literature, because people haven't been to the habitats. And it's like making a cake recipe book. We can increasingly begin to use assessment of scientific measurements of this is drought tolerance in maples. rather than just think, oh, I think that one's really drought tolerant. This tells you whether they're really drought tolerant. These are the drought tolerant ones. These are the non-drought tolerant ones. So you can begin to use this quantitative data that people say is beginning to appear. I think we'll pass on competition. Okay, so what about applying some of these ideas to real-world situations? So I'm going to start at the small scale, where fine-grained detail is important. I want to talk a little bit about this Melbourne Arts Precinct project, which I'm doing at the moment. And it looks like that. It's this area here. About 20,000 square meters of planting. It's got 14 art galleries next to it. It's a $1 billion project. It's like the High Line, but in Melbourne. Okay? And what we want to do here, it's about using planting as this external gallery space, and it'll be curated like the inside of the galleries. And so they want to have change, seasonal change every month, so they have something different happening. And when you come to actually think about the planting strategy for this, this is the starting point always. I always want to write a narrative to unpick the intellectual underpinning of what this is all about. So as you've already heard, Melbourne is a very contested place in terms of identity. It's got an Aboriginal base. We kill most of those, some left, and then we have lots of white fellows come in, and then we have lots of other migrants. So today, Melbourne is this hugely multicultural society. So the question is, whose values? Whose values do we borrow for the Melbourne Arts Precinct? Do we borrow the values of a past Aboriginal society? Do we borrow the values of a current day Aboriginal society? Do we pick on the values of Vietnamese people? Or white British? Whose values do we pick? And I agree with Peter. It's an extremely difficult thing to actually do. So these are all possibilities. Is it about revealing or challenging the past? Is it about identity? Is it a model for sustainable sustainable living? So I don't want to irrigate this, because that's just a delusion for the future. So how can we do it without any irrigation and for it to look good throughout the year? Is it about the local? Is it about the international? Is it about degree of human control? Is it about rewilding? What is it about? So you have all these ideas which you have to front end your planting design decisions with. Otherwise you are a neophyte, you're an intellectual sort of pygmy. That's all you've got to do. So I'm thinking something like this, layers, 4 layers, emergent, bigger, herbaceous, woody, shrubby, got to be a lot of succulents, and then some seasonal ephemerals. Something like this. I thought there's a drip, keeps coming down there. And to do that, we need to have lots of different species, so we have to think about when they're going to flower, and we've got to work all this out. And we're going to make them into 3 layers. I work with 3-layer communities a lot because you need to cram in a lot of complexity to get this long-term change. So that then looks like something like that. You just build it up. That's how we do this. That's how we get the complexity, the spatial complexity in time. This is how nature works. It's not how landscape architects work, but it's how nature works. And then we make up these sorts of planting mixes or whatever. I'm almost there, by the way. Can we just give me a few more minutes, boss? Just a few more minutes. Hey, come on, I'm on 45 minutes. I'm still on. We started 20, I'm on 40 minutes, so I've got 5 minutes. Okay, so we need to think about that and also about those things, about competition, climate fitness, habitat matching, all the rest. We need to go through that changes. That planting, that's what we made. That's 3-layer planting with South African species at the London Olympic Park, using the table I showed you was the planting plan. Yeah? That's the planting plan. And it makes, makes that, and it makes that. Okay? So we need to rethink some of the ways in which we do planting. Okay, one of the things we want to do too, we want to use, one of the problems with doing this sort of planting is, will it be manageable? Will you be able to prevent weed invasion? And so now we've developed this technique of deep gravel mulchal planting. We just plant into deep gravel on top of soil. So it's a very dry surface, give very, very limited weed invasion into this because of the lack of fines in the material. So that's planting. That's 9 months later, a project in London, and that's the same in 2019. Virtually no weeding for 2 years. No irrigation, very, very low maintenance. So we can apply those techniques. We applied these techniques to a project in Beijing. This is the New Silk Road, a big project, about 1,500 square meters, a permanent demonstration project in Beijing with Tom Stewart Smith. Planting plan looks like that. Didn't show that to the Chinese. They would have had a meltdown. Just did it. And just after planting, it looked like that in March. So it builds in drainage surface, you know, it's all water management stuff too. And then it looks like that in May. Looks like that in July. Looks like that in October. The Chinese think it's magic because they have no concept of the idea that things can come and go. They're so consumerized, they just think it all happens on one day. And it raises all sorts of questions about how do you manage these things. These are positives, you know. Costs more to do that. This is what Chinese woodlands normally like. Get less biodiversity, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, there's a whole range of costs and benefits. This is just a planting a new woodland I'm doing for Xiaoyang, which is the new Beijing, just a demonstration woodland. Looking at diversity, each color is a different species of tree. Okay? So trying to get these things taken up, you know, the bowl of rice versus the banquet, the slog, it's really, really hard. So it's to begin to get them to think about spatial complexity, really hard in people who are eco-hostile, really hard. And then you put a bit of color in and that does a bit more, ooh, I like that. Evergreen cores, deciduous edges, that works really well in Western China with government people. And then you can, you know, as a designer, you can think about human beings, whether they're less ecocentric or more ecocentric, how they would respond to these design interventions that you make. So when I'm designing, I'm thinking this stuff in my head. Yeah, so if you add more canopy layers, it's really negative for eco-hostiles, but it's not a problem for ecocentrics. Do you get the idea? We're not the same, we're different. Some people will love it, some people will think it's shit. That's how it is, that's inevitable, you can't get away from that. It's not a contest. And you've got the same for biodiversity, how these things actually affect biodiversity. I'm going to pass on that, it's Olympic Park. I was going to put it in just to show, I think it's one of my projects, which 10 years later, it really does what it said on the can. It really does do it. I was there a few days ago. It's still really successful in biodiversity, and people seem to love it. But it requires tolerance of disorder. It's very much for people who can deal with disorder in cities. That's just, you know, that's crazy and wild. You try doing that in Moscow. Might be challenging. Might not. And finally, just to finish on, last 2 minutes. I just want to show you these ideas at the very, very biggest scales. So this is Longquanshan. This is a design project in Chengdu. It's to reimagine a mountain range which is being cleared by peasant agriculture over 50 years. Big international design competition. I put a team together with LDA Design and Grimshaw's Architecture. £1 million first prize. We won. And so our vision has been taken on by the Chengdu government as the policy framework for the future of this mountain range. And it's all about, you know, to quote Julian Raxby, it's not just about the quick hit. It's not about the design and run away. It's about engagement and management over decades. I'll be dead, but someone will do it. So here we have it. This is it. This is the competition. This is Longquanshan. This is Chengdu, city of, they say 11, but I guess 20 million. This is the mountain range, 100 kilometers long. The mountain is 1,200 square kilometers. That's the mountain as you drive towards it. And that's what it looks like without the blue lines. The blue lines was just me trying to conceptualize what was there. Now I could do that because I know I am an expert on the Western Chinese vegetation. So I could see what was rubbish and what was actually worth keeping. The Chinese have no idea about that. It's just green stuff to them. And what I wanted to do was to put it back to that, because that's what it used to look like before Mao. It was cleared in the last 70 years. And this vegetation is almost extinct now in Chengdu, so we want to put it back, and that's the vision as the new landscape frame for Longquanshan. So it's all about doing these things, facilitating long-term ecological processes, joint emphasis on biodiversity, long-term management forever, not something which is part of the Chinese mentality in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And I really wanted to do this. I wanted to challenge Chinese notions about this instant landscape. They see landscape as like buying a new Mercedes. It's just a product. You buy it, you spend a lot of money, and that's it. It's done. That's not the way forward. It's not sustainable. It's not possible. So I really wanted to really challenge them. So here we are. So what the big problem we had really is that the plants we want to use, no one grows them in nurseries. So what as part of the project is they pay us to go out with Chinese partners, and we find and we collect from the remnants of vegetation in Western China these species, and we are setting up a nursery industry on a massive scale to do this. So here, that's a good bit. That's rubbish. That's rubbish. That's a remnant on a ridge. Okay? There we are. Seed collecting. Not a tiger there. Should planting design and the value of knowledge on vegetation be a core part of landscape architecture?
Microphone.
And if you believe differently, you have a conversation with Greta and see how well you do out of that. She's pretty scary. On the other hand, in Britain, the Landscape Institute, our professional body, has recently decided that planting design is not a core skill for landscape architects. And that what Berkeley does is really good. How crazy, what are these people on? So it's going to be difficult to achieve this out with a change of perspective in some of the universities that teach landscape architecture, to do this integration of plant understanding and design. That's what we really need. So it's not clear where this drive's going to come from, but vegetation is core to many of the solutions to the environment and human challenges of the 21st century. So let's hope we can do it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Well, I was so interested that I did not want to interrupt you. Anyway, I'm going to give you 5 minutes for the Q&A. We don't have any questions. That's great. In that case, well, I'm not going to ask you a question. Well, I don't have a question. I'm not going to ask you a question. I just wanted to thank you for raising such important issues. In my country, I come from Minsk, that's Belarus. I always tell people about the opportunities and the biodiversity of the various plants and vegetation. I try. Testing, 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 testing.
About the biological variety, that we can have different plants. We can have different varieties of plants, and it is possible to plant them in our country. And people do not hear. And I can say thank you for your speaking about it. Thank you very much. It is a great problem. We must solve it.
Any other questions? We don't seem to have any questions. Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew. Go ahead.
I get it all. Is that working? Yeah. So I really, really get it all, and I'm inspired by it. There's one contradiction, though, that keeps coming back to me, and this is this.
Full of contradictions.
I know, and you showed the one. So you at the end there with the Chinese thing, you were referring to the forest from millennia ago, and kind of how that was the good stuff. And then on the other hand, you're saying that we need to embrace lots of other plant life that probably isn't what we perceive as being native to that environmental place. And somehow, like when you showed the Olympic Park, you showed the very native-looking one at the end, and then you showed the South African one. Well, the South African one, although it looked really bright and pretty, it didn't look what we would think of as being something that was native to that place.
Yeah.
So there's that slight contradiction there. So you seem to kind of almost, kind of say that the one thing is the good stuff,
Yep.
but then you're promoting
Sure.
diversity of other
Well,
plants.
it's an entirely reasonable comment to make. I mean, the way I would answer it is that it's very important not to see the world in binary terms, okay? It's either black or grey. And of course, the reality is, the way in which you make those decisions is very much in the context of where you are. So in the Olympic Park, you come across the bridge, or you did in the Games, and those gardens tell the story of the British obsession with planting and how we collected all over the place. And that's very much part of our national psyche, and that's made us who we are. And then, and obviously we don't want to have that everywhere because it's not sustainable in terms of management. And so when you move a couple of 100 meters into the North Park, you move into a native vegetation type, which is right there. It's sustainable. It's got good value for biodiversity. The South African stuff's not bad for biodiversity, to be honest. Not as good as the native, but it's not bad. It's sustainable, and in 10 years' time, it'll still be there, and it'll still be doing a thing at low cost. So it's purely a question of not being defined in a binary sense. So I don't see any conflict whatsoever. I mean, I designed the South African stuff, and then I designed the native stuff in the North Park. I just put a different hat on the native man, non-native man. I'm still me. I mean, look, we are complicated beings. We are complicated beings. We're not either black or white. We are, I mean, when you ask people in a woodland new town in Britain, which is the peak of the ecological woodland movement in the UK, when we asked them as researchers, what did they like most about living in this woodland new town? They said, the woodlands. And when we said, what do you like least about living in Warrington Newtown? They said, the woodlands. They feared the woodlands at night when they had to walk outside, and they loved the woodlands during the day when they didn't feel threatened because they could see. And that's how human beings are. You have to be an imbecile to be binary. Being binary is a no, when George Bush says you're either with us or you're against us. I mean, we all laugh at that. We think it's ridiculous political rhetoric. It's just as ridiculous in the vegetation world.
Okay, so one more quick thing. So then, as an academic, do you think with all this research, which is great to be sharing it with us or to be doing it in the public realm, do you think you're doing enough to share it with nurseries, the commercial sector, people supplying plants, so that there is that availability for the general public and for designers to be able to access, you know, this diversity of plants that you're talking about?
Well, the simple answer to that is no. The problems are quite significant because it's all about copyright. We write that stuff in obscure journals that only certain people have access to because someone has to pay for the publication of the work, and that's done in a market economy. That's done through subscription. But I completely get it. I mean, obviously, I'm not the sort of academic who sort of sits in the ivory tower. You know, I'm on the ground, so I do feel that very strongly. What we are doing in Sheffield at the moment is we are developing a new digital platform to share all of my in-depth understanding of the integration of ecology into the industry. So this will link the nursery codes of wholesale nurseries. It's been funded by DEFRA at the moment in the short term. So this will be a way to try to pull everything together, and it will be a platform which, as new research becomes available, it will be downloadable to this platform. We see it as a 21st century information source of people who design. It's called Future Flora. And we're just kicking off with it at the moment. There's a team of us doing it. So I think that will be a huge contribution, but you'll still have to subscribe to it because we want to make some cash.
So it's like, how important is the environment? Because there's always a cost to it, and that's why this information isn't being shared with that kind of, you know, the Castoramas or the B&Qs or the home bases of the world, which are supplying plants to the masses. You know, it's all very well saying we've got to do all of this for the environment, but then it's not being shared.
Sure. But I mean, the reason B&Q don't do this is not because not being shared. They do it because simply they want to maximize return on capital. And so that's a much bigger issue. You can show B&Q this data, they're going to change what they do. That can only come through the public actually, say, demanding something and say, we won't buy that. You know, we live in a capitalist world, and you know, unless we have a different system, and that doesn't seem it's going to happen anytime soon, it's a difficult one.
Hey.
Извините, а можно еще?
I'm sorry, can I ask you one last question? Do we still have time for one last question? I was just wondering, are there any studies on the regenerated territories? Do you have any data on the native species, whether the native insects come back to these recultivated areas? And what lives do they live? How sustainable such areas are? How many years does it take for an ecosystem with insects and rodents to appear?
Well, I think the question was about long-term views, really, of this sort of stuff. When I work on projects, I only really normally want to work on them if I can have long-term involvement. And so on most projects, I go every year to look at the project, how it's developing, 10 years, 12, 15 years later, and they pay me to do that. Sometimes I do it for free. If I think it's actually really worth doing. I go to the Olympic Park every year, just for free. I pay to go there myself. And I think that's part of the ethical, professional responsibility to do that. And the reality is, if you maintain engagement with projects in the longer term, you have a much, much better chance of those projects being successful in the longer term. It's this walking away, which is like institutionalized in most landscape architectural practice, which is hugely problematic. Now, I know it's really difficult because many clients do not want to pay for that long-term view. But the reality is, you know, when things crash and burn, it crashes and burns normally because there was no one there to give the continuity of view, which is what you really need. In terms of insects and that, increasingly on some projects in the public space, at the Olympic Park, for example, the maintenance contractors, as part of their contract, they have to do sampling of invertebrate diversity within the Olympic Park. So they have to be able to relate how many insect species there are to how they are managing the landscape. So that's a really interesting idea, but it's only going to be feasible on some projects. But it's an interesting idea if you can make it work.
Alessandro?
Yes, I was asking if, do you think that mixing native and non-native plants in the urban landscape could represent well the complexity of the community of the contemporary time?
You mean would it be better or worse than what was there originally? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, we this will probably piss a few people off, but anyway, I'll say it anyway. I'm saying this as research scientist who's familiar with the literature. This is not my own personal view. What we mostly have in most human cultures, we have a belief system which says that what occurs naturally is the peak of evolutionary possibility. Okay, so that if you've got a native vegetation, you cannot support more wildlife than that because that represents some sort of peak. That is not necessarily true. So the latest work on pollinators in the UK, a very, very large study that looked at 4 cities, and what they did is they looked at actually pollinator diversity in different numbers of species in a whole range of different urban landscape types, from streets through to nature reserves, to cemeteries, to parks, to gardens, to vegetable allotments. And what they found is that the most diverse communities in terms of native invertebrates were not found in the natural systems. They were found in the human-managed systems, which were managed to be particularly resource abundant. And these were gardens of mainly alien species and allotments, vegetable allotments, because people planted species all the time, so there was always fresh leaves to feed on, and there were always flowers for a very long season. So invertebrate diversity and density is very much driven by the long-term availability of resources. It's not about passports. You know, it's not really. It's not about those. The invertebrates are, in most cases, Catholic, especially pollinators. They don't care where the species come from. They don't know where the things come from. They judge it on the sugar concentration of the nectar and the pollen quality. And so in many parts of the world, the most desirable plants for pollinators, like bees, will be the ones with the highest sugar content. And when you do research, it's very clear that this is what's going on. They don't say, oh, you're a foreigner, I'm not coming to feed on you. They simply say, what's the sugar concentration? Yeah, pretty good, I'm there. Woomph. So there are good natives, and there are bad natives. There are good exotics, and there are bad exotics. It's a bit like human beings.
Yes, I think also that is. And probably they can teach something also to us.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
I think it's this thing which is now very much the issue of nature against nature, the value of DNA, the extent to which our inherited DNA determines 80% of our qualities, and 20% is to do with nature, and the radical adoption is what keeps Darwinism and the strongest species going, and it's not reducible to these narrow binary qualities of natural and foreign. That's imposed by market values, it's imposed by concepts of landscape architects and so on, and this binary world is really breaking down, and we need to develop a much more sophisticated view of things.
Yeah. But I mean, when I'm in China, I really want to use native species because they're not doing it. So it's a huge missed opportunity to do something extraordinary and interesting. And so there I'm absolutely passionately pro-native species, because, you know, it's crazy to live in a city where you use 5 native species and there's a flora of 5,000. It's a loss of opportunity. But that's me making judgments as a conscious human being about what is appropriate, you know. It's not absolutely God-given. It's about choice and decisions and, you know, whatever.